You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's November 7th, 1962, in the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles. Former Vice President Richard Nixon sits in his hotel room, stewing. He's just lost his second major political race in 2 years. First the presidency against John F. Kennedy in 1960, and now the California governorship against incumbent governor, Democrat Pat Brown. Nixon is dog-tired, and it shows on his face. He's unshaven and unkempt. Exhausted, he sent his press secretary Herb Klein downstairs to read his concession speech to the press. From his room, Nixon watched on TV as Klein read his statement. He watched as the reporters hounded him, demanding that Nixon make a personal appearance. And he watched as Klein sheepishly retreated from the podium. Now Nixon can barely contain his rage. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Dick. That was a disaster, Herb." "Yeah, they want you downstairs." "Well, I don't care what they want. It's a bad look you not showing your face. After the way they've treated me, there's no way I'm going down there." "Dick, please, think of your future. Would you please consider taking just a few questions?" "Nah, screw them. I'm not going to do it. I don't have to, and I'm not going to. You read them my concession. If they want to know where I am, you can tell them I've gone home to be with my family." "But you're not home with your family. You're right here, Dick. They're going to keep asking for you. And then if you don't show up, they'll say Mr. Nixon is nowhere to be found." And sure enough, just then on the TV set, a reporter turns to the camera and asks, "Where is Richard Nixon? He's nowhere to be found." Nixon boils with rage. To Nixon, the reporter's tone is an insult, but no more insulting than the way the press as a whole has treated him the entire campaign. The reporter seems to be suggesting that Nixon owes them an explanation, but Nixon feels he owes them nothing. Still, something in the reporter's smug tone spurs Nixon to action. And just as Klein is about to walk out the door and give him some privacy, Nixon leaps to his feet. "Herb, wait." Klein looks back at Nixon. Nixon's eyes steel and he stiffens his back. "I'm going down there." After his conversation with Herb Klein, Nixon took the elevator downstairs, walked into the press room, stood at the podium, and addressed the reporters.
I believe Governor Brown has a heart. I believe he is a good American, even though he feels I am not. I'm proud of the fact that I defended my opponent's patriotism. You gentlemen didn't report it, but I'm proud that I did that. And as I leave the press, all I can say is this. For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, you've had a lot of fun. I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
The reporters were stunned into silence. With a curt "goodbye, gentlemen," Nixon left the hotel, off to begin his long vacation from politics. Afterwards, his opponent Pat Brown said, "That's something Nixon's going to regret all his life. The press is never going to let him forget it." But the reaction was not all negative. As Nixon wrote, "I received thousands of letters from friends and supporters across the country who said they were glad that someone finally had the guts to tell the press off." The press may have believed Nixon was finished, but the man they called Tricky Dick wasn't going anywhere. In the election of 1968, Nixon would reinvent his image and stage what is arguably the greatest political comeback in American history. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get her half of history, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ as he was known, had a grand vision for America. Johnson's Great Society, a series of laws and domestic policies aimed at eradicating poverty and racial inequality, had made significant strides. Under LBJ, Medicare and Medicaid were established, bringing health care to millions of Americans. Under pressure from civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, LBJ also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, laws that made significant progress towards establishing equality between the races. But by 1968, the promise of the Great Society was threatened by the seemingly never-ending war in Vietnam. Across the country, pro-peace Americans demonstrated and marched against the war, decrying the misallocation of government resources and the immorality of the draft lottery. Between 1964 and 73, the U.S. military would draft 2.2 million American men. Over 58,000 would die. Meanwhile, as the civil rights movement continued to gain steam, progress was often met with violent pushback from communities, politicians, and local state and federal authorities. In the face of mounting opposition, Dr. King advocated for nonviolent resistance and joined in the nation's calls to end the Vietnam War. The surge of protests and demonstrations left President Johnson politically vulnerable. As members of LBJ's own party turned their backs on their president, former Republican Vice President Richard Nixon saw an opportunity to re-enter the fold and remake his image. Amidst the rampant civil unrest, a new Nixon would emerge with a promise to right a chaotic, broken nation. This is episode 46, 1968, Nixon versus Humphrey versus Wallace, Law and Order. Perhaps the first sign that LBJ's presidency was under siege came in November of 1967, when Minnesota Senator and Liberal Democrat Eugene McCarthy announced his candidacy for president. To many Washington insiders, McCarthy's staunchly anti-war posture seemed like a losing strategy. But that changed in January of 1968 with the Tet Offensive, a series of bloody, coordinated attacks by the North Vietnamese. Countless Americans watched on television with dismay as the North Vietnamese overran the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Though the North Vietnamese were eventually beaten back, the human cost was tremendous. And for Americans watching at home, it did not look like a victory. At the New Hampshire primary on March 12, 1968, McCarthy's anti-war message brought him within 8 points of beating LBJ, signaling that the embattled president was vulnerable. Days later, on March 16, 1968, another Democratic candidate with a famous last name threw his hat into the ring.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world.
New York Senator Robert Bobby Kennedy, the brother of the late President John F. Kennedy, had long been a thorn in LBJ's side. During the election of 1960, Bobby had tried to talk his brother out of selecting LBJ as his running mate. But President Kennedy had seen the value of bringing a popular Southerner like LBJ onto the ticket. Bobby had no choice but to accept LBJ, but Bobby wasn't quiet about his disdain, and LBJ wasn't quiet about the feeling being mutual. But if there was one man LBJ despised more than Bobby Kennedy, it was perhaps the presumptive Republican nominee, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Nixon had announced his candidacy in February of 1968. Nixon had stood before the press at the Holiday Inn in Manchester, New Hampshire, and joked, "Gentlemen, this is not my last press conference." Nixon hoped to position himself as the law and order candidate, the man to restore peace to a broken nation. But after Nixon's announcement, many Republican Party leaders were concerned. In 1968, the GOP was still reeling from Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater's crushing defeat 4 years earlier. Goldwater had run as a staunch conservative, and his strategy had backfired. LBJ had beaten Goldwater in a landslide. So in 1968, the GOP needed a candidate who could unite the conservative and moderate factions who were at war over the soul of the party. Many in the GOP worried that Nixon's political past, which had earned him the nickname Tricky Dick, disqualified him from the task at hand. Indeed, Nixon's political past was not squeaky clean. He had previously won a seat in the House of Representatives, beating a 5-term establishment candidate by suggesting he had ties to a communist group. Then, in a subsequent race for the Senate, Nixon had doubled down on this tactic, openly accusing his opponent of being a communist. Nixon's critics accused him of frequently using the Red Scare as a tool to launch his political career. During the 1952 election, when Nixon was General Dwight D. Eisenhower's running mate, Democrats had accused Nixon of lining his pockets with a secret political fund. Eisenhower had been so furious with Nixon over the scandal that he almost replaced him. But Nixon had been clever. Instead of resigning under pressure, Nixon had gone on national television and endeared himself to the American people, claiming that the political fund was neither illegal nor secret. The American people had believed him, and ultimately so had Eisenhower. But the Washington establishment did not forget Nixon's tricky ways, and neither did Nixon's enemies in the Republican Party. So on the campaign trail in 1968, Nixon was determined to avoid the mistakes of his past. He resolved to craft a reformed image of a new Nixon, a respectable man of decorum and integrity. In order to build this image, Nixon sought the help of a young conservative up-and-comer in the media business, a TV producer by the name of Roger Ailes. Going into the New Hampshire primary, Roger Ailes, the future chairman and CEO of Fox News, knew that Nixon was not great on television. Ailes believed Nixon had one of the worst track records on TV in American politics. He had certainly not forgotten how badly JFK had trounced Nixon in 1960 during the first ever televised presidential debate. Nixon hadn't forgotten either. So in order to win New Hampshire, Ailes knew Nixon needed to connect with voters. Ailes also knew Nixon did not come off as a warm, approachable person, not on television. So in New Hampshire, Ailes developed a plan. He kept Nixon away from the press and instead created a brilliant piece of political advertising, a filmed Q&A between Nixon and New Hampshire Republicans. The Q&A seemed to be organic and off the cuff, but it was fully curated to cement the image of the new Nixon in the minds of American voters. The Q&A was edited into a series of political ads that played in targeted markets all across New Hampshire. Though this particular type of political ad is now commonplace, Roger Ailes arguably invented it in 1968, and it worked. At the New Hampshire primary in March, Nixon won with 78% of the vote. By the end of that month of March, the situation in Vietnam showed no signs of improvement, and neither did the unrest in the streets. LBJ had essentially become a prisoner in the White House. He canceled all public speaking engagements due to the ongoing mass protests. And despite the achievements of his great society, for most Americans, LBJ's presidency had become synonymous with only Vietnam. So in late March 1968, Johnson spoke directly to the American people.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In his speech, Johnson vowed to focus his attention on ending the war in Vietnam and establishing a lasting peace. Johnson's abrupt exit left the Democratic nomination and the presidency up for grabs. But on the domestic front, peace was not in the cards. Days after LBJ's speech, tragedy would strike. It's April 3rd, 1968. Storm clouds gather as rain pours down into the streets of Memphis, Tennessee. A white Mustang with Alabama plates pulls into the parking lot of the New Rebel Motel, a brand new spot on the outskirts of southeast Memphis. When the Mustang comes to a stop near the front door of the motel office, a short-statured man with dark, wavy hair hops out and makes for the desk. Inside, there's a female attendant standing behind the counter. "Yes, sir, what can I do for you?" "I'd like a room, please, one night." "Of course. What's your name, sir?" "Galt. Eric Galt." That's not his name. It's a lie. But the nice woman behind the counter has no idea. She smiles and slides him a form to fill out. The man hands her cash, $6.24. She slides him a key. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Galt." "Thank you, ma'am." The man parks his car in front of room 34, grabs his things, and heads inside. He flips on the bedside lamp and turns on the overhead lights. He unpacks his small bag and carefully lays his items out on the foot of the bed: a Gillette shaving kit, a six-pack of beer, and an old wooden box 2 feet long and just under a foot wide. Outside, the wind howls and blows as the rain peppers into the window of his room. The man cracks open a Schlitz beer and turns on the TV.
If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions.
The dark-haired man already knew that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis. That's why the dark-haired man made the drive all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. But he didn't expect to see Dr. King on television. Later that night, something else catches his eye on the news. B-roll footage of Dr. King standing on the balcony of the nearby Lorraine Hotel. The man turns his attention away from the TV and back to his carefully laid out belongings. He opens the wooden box on the foot of the bed. Inside is a bolt-action Remington rifle with a scope and a 20-cartridge box of 30-06 bullets. While James Earl Ray drank beer in his hotel room, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech across town at the Masonic Temple in support of a local sanitation workers' strike.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind.
The next day, on April 4th, 1968, James Earl Ray checked out of the New Rebel Motel and moved to a rooming house near the Lorraine Hotel where Dr. King was staying. He chose a room with a clear line of sight, and at around 6 p.m., as Dr. King stood on a balcony, James Earl Ray, from the bathroom window of his room, took up his rifle, trained his sights on Dr. King, and fired. That night, Robert F. Kennedy was in Indianapolis, Indiana for a campaign event. After hearing the news, Bobby addressed the crowd.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Bobby spoke to the crowd's pain by talking about his own.
For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times.
Bobby's calming words did not stave off conflict. In response to Dr. King's assassination, demonstrations sprung up all across the country. In Boston, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C., protesters marched and clashed with police as buildings went up in flames. But as Americans all across the country watched the turmoil unfold on television, Bobby Kennedy sought to amplify a message of hope. His campaign message was an echo of Dr. King's philosophies. Bobby was making an appeal, not to the Democratic establishment or the wealthy elite, but to poor, disenfranchised Americans, both black and white. In the tradition of Dr. King, Kennedy advocated for equality, justice, and peace, both at home and abroad. But in the race for the Democratic nomination, not everyone was an anti-war candidate seeking peace. Johnson's Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey entered the race as the establishment candidate. Humphrey, also known as the Happy Warrior, officially announced his candidacy on April 27, 1968. Humphrey hoped to become the first sitting vice president to win the White House in an election since Martin Van Buren. But from the very beginning, Humphrey's campaign struck a discordant tone. In his announcement speech, Humphrey told the crowd, "Here we are, the way politics ought to be in America, the politics of happiness, politics of purpose, politics of joy. And that's the way it's going to be from here on out." Humphrey's positive message was belied by a myriad of factors: the raging Vietnam War, the protests and riots, and most recently, the assassination of Dr. King. To many of his critics, Humphrey's announcement seemed tone-deaf, out of touch, and uninspiring. As one commentator would later write, "There was nothing in Humphrey's announcement speech for anyone to get excited about. Every Humphrey supporter watching knew instantly that their candidate was the most boring man in the race, including Nixon." So as the Democratic establishment was preparing to merely stomach Hubert Humphrey, Nixon was gearing up to make one of the greatest political comebacks in American history. Still, there was one Democratic candidate who threatened to derail his plans. As Nixon would later write, "I saw no way a Kennedy juggernaut could be stopped once it had acquired the momentum of a California victory." So in June of 1968, Nixon watched the California Democratic primary unfold with bated breath, knowing full well his own political future was hanging in the balance. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's early June 1968 at Richard Nixon's apartment in Manhattan. Nixon and his family are glued to their television sets.
This is a CBS News special report on the California primary. Here is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The polls have just closed in California's presidential primary.
Nixon sits with his wife Pat, his daughters Tricia and Julie's fiancé, David Eisenhower, the grandson of former President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
And a special CBS News survey of voters leaving the polling places
indicates that Senator Robert F. Kennedy is leading solidly in the Democratic race with almost 50% of the vote. He's ahead of Senator
Nixon sighs. Sure looks like we'll be going up against Bobby. Anxious, Nixon stands up and starts to excuse himself. His wife Pat is concerned. Where are you going, Dick? I'm off to bed. David Eisenhower senses Nixon's unease, so he makes a generous offer. No worries, Mr. Nixon. I'll stay up all night watching. I'll give you a full report in the morning. Well, thank you, David. Good night. As Nixon lays down to sleep, his mind is racing. If Bobby Kennedy wins in California, the Democratic nomination is his for the taking. Nixon likes his chances against Eugene McCarthy, but Bobby is a different story. The Kennedy name carries a significant weight. Not to mention Bobby is nearly as beloved as his late brother. But eventually Nixon's nerves give way to exhaustion and he drifts off to sleep. Excuse me, sir, Mr. Nixon. When Nixon's eyes flutter open, he sees David Eisenhower standing in his room, panic in his voice and fear in his eyes. What is it, David? They shot Kennedy, sir. What? He's still alive, but he's unconscious. They shot him right after his victory speech. Robert F. Kennedy was shot on June 5, 1968 by a Palestinian Christian militant named Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan was angry at Kennedy for his support of Israel during the Six-Day War of June 1967, a conflict between Israel and Egypt. One of Sirhan's last journal entries read, "My determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more and more of an unshakable obsession. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 5th. After being mortally wounded by Sirhan's pistol, Kennedy lay on his back in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. When medical attendants arrived and tried to lift Kennedy onto a stretcher, he spoke his last words before fading into unconsciousness. "Don't lift me." The next day, Nixon was working in his study when his wife Pat came in. With tears in her eyes, she told him the news. "Dick, that poor boy just died. It's on the radio." Along with President Johnson and thousands of grieving Americans, Nixon and his wife attended Bobby Kennedy's funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Nixon later wrote that he was deeply moved by the eulogy delivered by Bobby's brother, Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy.
My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it.
After the funeral, as Nixon wrote, all the candidates observed a moratorium on campaigning. President Johnson ordered round-the-clock Secret Service protection for all presidential candidates and their families. In the summer of 1968, Nixon hoped to ride the wave of his newfound image as a dignified statesman all the way to the Republican National Convention in early August 1968. The Republican field was crowded with big names. California Governor Ronald Reagan was extremely popular with many conservative Republicans, and business tycoon Nelson Rockefeller appealed to many liberal Republicans. Nixon stood somewhere in the middle, which could work to his advantage if he could convince the delegates that the new Nixon was a uniter. At the Miami Beach Convention Center in Dade County, Florida, Richard Nixon did just that. He stayed above the fray and kept the conversation focused on his message, the importance of law and order and Johnson's failure to end the Vietnam War.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States. As we look at America, we see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. We see Americans dying on distant battlefields abroad. We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. And as we see and hear these things, millions of Americans cry out in anguish. Did we come all this way for this? Did American boys die in Normandy and Korea and in Valley Forge for this? Listen to the answer to those questions. It is another voice. It is a quiet voice in the tumult of the shouting. It is the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. They're good people. They're decent people. They work and they save and they pay their taxes and they care.
Nixon's campaign slogan, "Nixon's the One," set the tone for his candidacy, as did his campaign song of the same name.
Stand up and let's strike the band up. Who's lifting us land up? Yes, Nixon's the one to go. We'll shout it.
As the Republicans rallied around Richard Nixon, the Democrats geared up for their convention in Chicago. But if the Republican convention was a gleeful affair, the Democratic convention would be an unmitigated disaster. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago began in late August 1968. In the run-up to the convention, Vice President Humphrey was trailing Nixon in the polls. He was also trailing the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy. As a result, President Johnson was getting worried. Nixon can be beaten, Johnson believed, but not with Eugene McCarthy at the top of the ticket. Johnson was also aggravated by rumors that Senator Ted Kennedy might enter the race at the final hour. In Washington, Johnson mulled over flying to the convention and re-entering the contest himself. Meanwhile, in the streets of Chicago, tensions were boiling. Thousands of anti-war protesters had descended upon downtown Chicago. The protesters were members and supporters of various organizations, among them the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, or MOBI. Others were members of a new anti-political party, the Youth International Party, or Yippies for short. These protesters, largely supporters of candidate Eugene McCarthy, demanded the immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. The Chicago Police Department, under orders from Democratic Mayor Richard Daley, worked around the clock trying to prepare for the influx of protesters. Political activist Tom Hayden summed up the mood in the streets. The North Vietnamese are shedding blood. We must be prepared to shed blood. On Thursday, August 22nd, a matter of days before the convention began, Chicago police stopped two young people near Lincoln Park, the place where the SDS had set up camp. According to the police, one of the two, a 17-year-old indigenous American from the Sioux Nation named Dean Johnson, allegedly pulled a pistol. The officers shot him dead. Soon, mourning protesters gathered in Lincoln Park to hold a vigil. It was a peaceful gathering, but many protesters were skeptical of the police's version of their encounter with Dean Johnson, and anger was simmering. The Yippies planned to hold a mock political convention on Sunday, August 25th, the day before the Democratic Convention. On Friday, August 23rd, the Yippies gathered in a public courtyard downtown to introduce their candidate to the press, a 145-pound pig named Pegasus. The police quickly broke up the Yippie gathering. They arrested Yippie leader Jerry Rubin and several other protesters for disturbing the peace. Pegasus was handed over to the Humane Society. Soon, droves of National Guardsmen and Chicago police officers assembled around downtown, armed with weapons and tear gas, ready to face more protests. On Sunday, August 25th, the protesters marched through the streets chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The police largely stood by and watched, but tensions were high. Thankfully, things remained peaceful until the sun went down. Police had instituted an 11 p.m. curfew. As Chicago PD tried to get the protesters to leave, unknown persons started throwing rocks. In response, the police charged the crowd. The clash was violent, but it was short. By 2 a.m, order was restored, but not for long. The next day, Monday, August 26th, the first gavel fell at the Chicago Amphitheater, and the 1968 Democratic National Convention was officially underway. Over the next few days, delegates inside the hall engaged in the usual horse trading. They hotly debated the party's position on the war, pro-peace versus pro-Johnson. In the end, the pro-peace plank was defeated, and the party's platform largely backed the Johnson administration's position on Vietnam. In the end, though, the political decisions made at the convention were largely overshadowed by the chaos in the streets. On Wednesday, August 28, 1968, the police went to war with protesters in what would come to be called the Battle of Michigan Avenue. Eugene McCarthy was on an upper floor of the Conrad Hilton in downtown Chicago when the protesters converged on the streets below him. McCarthy watched from the window of his campaign's hotel suite as the crowd of protesters chanted "Peace now" and "Fuck you, LBJ." McCarthy also watched as the police rushed the protesters. Tear gas was deployed, property damaged, innocent bystanders were trampled. Protesters were beaten and hauled away. And all the while, cameras were rolling, and Americans all across the country watched the horrific scene unfold on television. When word of the chaos outside reached the delegates inside the Chicago Amphitheater, hell broke loose. The nominations for president had begun at around 6 p.m. that night. By 9:30 p.m., the news of the Battle of Michigan Avenue broke inside the hall, and delegates learned of the scope of what was happening outside in the streets. Seeing the news reports, many delegates called for an adjournment. Others demanded that Mayor Daley put an end to the violence. Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff, a supporter of the late Bobby Kennedy, took the floor and made an explosive speech. With Bobby dead, Senator Ribicoff did not support Eugene McCarthy or Hubert Humphrey. He supported a long-shot candidate, Senator George McGovern. In his fiery speech, Senator Ribicoff declared, "Mr. Chairman, I have a speech here. As I watch on television the turmoil and violence that is competing with this great convention for the attention of the American people, there is something else in my heart tonight. That's not the speech I prepared to give. The youth of America rallied to the standards of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago." The hall erupted in boos and angry shouts. Perhaps no one shouted louder than Mayor Daley. Daley allegedly shouted back, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch. You lousy motherfucker. Go home." If the average American was looking for something peaceful to watch on TV that night, they would have trouble finding it. Alongside the coverage of the chaos in Chicago was a televised debate on ABC between liberal writer Gore Vidal and conservative writer William F. Buckley. The two quickly clashed, and the conversation turned nasty.
Mr. Vidal, wasn't it a provocative act to try to raise the Viet Cong flag in the park in the film we just saw? Wouldn't that invite raising a Nazi flag in World War II would have had similar consequences?
You're so naive. People in the United States happen to believe that the United States policy is wrong in Vietnam, and the Viet Cong are correct in wanting to organize their country in their own way politically. If it is a novelty in Chicago, that is too bad. But I assume that the point of the American democry is you can express any point of view you want. Shut up a minute.
No, I won't. And some people were pro-Nazi, and the answer is that they were well treated by people who ostracized them, and I'm for ostracizing people who egg on other people to shoot American Marines and American soldiers. I know you don't care.
As far as I'm
concerned,
the only sort of pro-crypto-Nazi I can think of is yourself. Failing that, I would only say that we can't have.
Now listen, you
the right of assembly.
Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop calling names.
I'll slap you in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
Gentlemen, let's...
As Buckley sneered, "Now listen, you queer. Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi or I'll sock you in the goddamn face and you'll stay plastered," he was nearly out of his chair, inches from Vidal. The two men's contempt for each other was viscerally felt, and the profane slurs forced the exchange to be cut from the West Coast broadcast. The chaos that night was profound, but LBJ never flew to Chicago to enter the race, and Ted Kennedy never came forward as a dark horse candidate. So in the end, in the Chicago amphitheater that night, in spite of the fact that Hubert Humphrey had barely campaigned prior to the convention, and in spite of the fact that the tens of thousands of Democratic protesters across the country did not support him, Hubert Humphrey still won the nomination, much to the chagrin of a large portion of the Democratic base. Humphrey picked Maine Senator Edmund Muskie as his running mate, but it was the numbers in the streets that stole the headlines. In all, over 500 protesters were arrested. 100 protesters and 119 police officers were injured. Democratic Party leaders had hoped the 1968 convention would rally the American people behind their party, but there was still little enthusiasm for Hubert Humphrey, and with the whole world watching the violent and shameful display in Chicago, the Humphrey-Muskie ticket seemed doomed from the start. As one journalist wrote on the evening of the 28th, "The Democrats are finished." But as Republican nominee Richard Nixon watched the Democratic convention on television, he knew the game wasn't over yet. On September 4th, 1968, Nixon officially kicked off his fall campaign in Chicago. In contrast to the chaotic Democratic convention, Nixon was greeted by Chicagoans with cheers and smiles. Nixon would later write, "As our motorcade passed through Chicago's Loop at noontime, an estimated 500,000 people turned out in genuine good cheer, with frequent outbursts of enthusiastic support. The contrast with the bitter confrontation that Humphrey was now tied to could not have been greater." But Chicago was not the key to a Nixon victory. In order to beat Humphrey in the general election, Nixon needed to perform well in the South. Humphrey was on the ropes, but Nixon knew his prospects of dominating the South were threatened by the presence of a third-party candidate, the official nominee of the American Independent Party, the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Nixon did not invent the so-called Southern strategy. That achievement belongs to the supporters of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Leading up to the 1964 election, as President Johnson made strides toward equal rights for Black Americans, many white Southern Democrats had fled the Democratic Party. These Dixiecrats, as they were known, had been a reliable Democratic voter bloc for nearly a century. But Republican nominee Barry Goldwater had sought to lure these Dixiecrats into the Republican fold. But Goldwater's Southern strategy had failed. Discussing his 1964 defeat, Goldwater wrote, "When you've lost an election by that much, it isn't the case of whether you made the wrong speech or wore the wrong necktie. It was just the wrong time." In 1968, Richard Nixon believed the time for Goldwater's strategy had come. But Nixon's version of the Southern strategy was jeopardized by the presence of third-party candidate and former Democrat George Wallace. The staunchly anti-communist Wallace proudly flew the banner of states' rights. He vowed to never use federal dollars to push for integration or equality. He bemoaned the Washington establishment, saying, "When I'm president, I'll call back all the bureaucrats and throw all their briefcases into the Potomac River." Like Nixon, Wallace painted himself as a law and order candidate. But unlike Nixon, Wallace was a vocal segregationist. Wallace had said in 1963 that he was for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. His message, while repugnant to many, still resonated with many white, blue-collar workers who were frightened by the protests and civil unrest in the streets. So for Nixon's Southern strategy to work, Wallace would have to be dealt with. Fortunately for Nixon, Wallace would do the heavy lifting for him. In early October 1968, Wallace announced his running mate, the hawkish General Curtis LeMay. Wallace had been under fire for his lack of foreign policy experience, so he brought LeMay into the fold to silence his critics. But at a joint press conference at the Hilton in Pittsburgh, Bombs Away LeMay, as he was called, lived up to his nickname. Much to Wallace's surprise, LeMay told reporters, "Well, we seem to have a phobia about nuclear weapons. I don't believe the world will end if we explode a nuclear weapon." LeMay went on to support his opinion by explaining that many lab rats had survived government-sanctioned nuclear testing, saying, "The rats are supposed to be vaporized inside the firewall, but the rats out there are bigger, fatter, and healthier than they ever were before." Wallace tried to interrupt the general's damning diatribe, but LeMay kept digging the hole deeper.
Doesn't make much difference to me if I have to go to war and get killed in the jungle of Vietnam with a rusty knife or get killed with a nuclear weapon. As a matter of fact, if I had the choice, I'd lean towards a nuclear weapon.
After the LeMay press conference, Wallace's candidacy was all but over. Very few Americans could abide that sort of sentiment so close to the nuclear button. Very quickly thereafter, Nixon leaned into his Southern strategy and tried to pick up voters fleeing the Wallace camp. On the campaign trail in 1968, the new Nixon largely left the dirty campaigning to his vice presidential running mate, Spiro Agnew, or as many Republican delegates had called him prior to the 1968 convention, Spiro who? Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew was a relative unknown to the national scene, but Nixon had picked him with a purpose. After Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, protests had sprung up in cities all across the country, including in Baltimore, Maryland. Governor Agnew had blamed black leaders in Baltimore for the unrest. The Nixon campaign believed Agnew's tough talk would appeal to white voters in the South, and Agnew's willingness to get his hands dirty earned him the nickname Nixon's Nixon. So while Agnew fought dirty, Nixon tried to stay above the fray. He refused to debate Hubert Humphrey on national television. Even after Humphrey called him Richard the Chicken-Hearted, Nixon stayed quiet and limited his public appearances. On the trail, Nixon espoused traditional conservative values. As part of his Southern strategy, Nixon advocated for integration, but insisted the process be slow, deliberate, and careful, a signal to Southern voters who were worried about too much change too fast. But the centerpiece of Nixon's campaign was the issue of Vietnam. Nixon promised voters he would do what Vice President Humphrey and the Johnson administration had failed to do: end the war. But in the final stretch of the campaign, LBJ threw a wrench in Nixon's strategy. On October 26th, Nixon released a statement to the press reading, "In the last 36 hours, I've been advised that top officials in the Johnson administration have been driving very hard for an agreement on a bombing halt. I'm told that this is a cynical, last-minute attempt by President Johnson to salvage the candidacy of Mr. Humphrey. This I do not believe." But Nixon did believe it. He had run his campaign on the idea that the Democratic leadership was incapable of establishing a permanent peace. Nixon felt the timing of Johnson's announcement was meant to undercut his campaign message and prop up Vice President Humphrey. By pushing for peace so close to the election, Johnson was, in Nixon's words, making the one move that I thought could determine the outcome of the election. And so, with everything on the line, the new Nixon took a temporary backseat to Tricky Dick. It's October 31st, 1968, less than a week away from Election Day. Richard Nixon sits in the study of his Manhattan apartment. Later in the day, he's scheduled to make a speech at a nationally televised rally. As he pores over his notes, the phone rings. Hello? A White House operator tells Nixon that he's on the line with Mr. Humphrey and Mr. Wallace, holding for the president. But the three candidates barely have a chance to exchange pleasantries when President Johnson comes on the line. Gentlemen, there's been a breakthrough in Paris with the peace negotiations, and wanted you to be among the first to know. I've decided to call a total bombing halt over North Vietnam. I'm going to make the announcement on the air in 2 hours. Humphrey and Wallace are pleased. Nixon, though, is concerned. I don't know what this means for North Vietnam, Mr. President, but it's clear you've just dropped a bomb on me right in the middle of my campaign. Johnson explodes with indignation. I'm not concerned with an election. You all are concerned with an election. I don't think this concerns an election. I think all of you want the same thing. So I thought if I laid it on the line that way and presented it to you, you would at least have a complete, full understanding of the facts. Johnson continues his explanation of his actions with a brief Q&A. As Johnson finishes, George Wallace offers his support. Well, I'm praying for you, Mr. President. Thank you, George. Humphrey offers his as well. We'll back you up, Mr. President. Then there's a moment of silence. Nixon knows it's his turn to be supportive, but he's boiling with rage. Still, he keeps his cool. Thank you for the call, Mr. President. You have my support. Nixon was angry, but not surprised by Johnson's announcement. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I had known for several weeks that plans were being made for such an action." But according to Nixon, Johnson had promised to keep him in the loop, but Johnson had not held up his end of the bargain. As Nixon wrote, "The announcement was the other shoe that I had been waiting for Johnson to drop. What I found difficult to accept was the timing. Announcing the halt so close to the election was utterly callous, if politically calculated." The day after Johnson's announcement, one reporter wrote, "President Johnson gave Richard M. Nixon a trick and Vice President Humphrey a treat for Halloween when he announced a complete halt to the bombing of North Vietnam last night." Later that night of the phone call, at the Madison Square Garden rally on the evening of October 31st, Nixon told the American people, "I will say that as a presidential candidate, and my vice presidential candidate joins me in this, that neither he nor I will say anything that might destroy the chance to have peace." But according to most historians, that wasn't entirely true. Nixon biographer John A. Farrell discovered what he called a newfound cache of notes, which shows that Nixon directed his campaign's efforts to scuttle Johnson's peace talks. According to a New York Times profile on Farrell's Nixon biography, throughout much of the campaign, the Nixon team maintained a secret channel to the South Vietnamese through Anna Chennault. Chennault was a Chinese-born Republican fundraiser and a Nixon supporter. According to Farrell's cache of notes, in late October of 1968, Nixon directed a member of his team to monkey-wrench Johnson's peace talks. While the Johnson administration pushed the North and South Vietnamese towards a bombing halt, Chennault quietly worked behind the scenes in Paris to convince the South Vietnamese government to hold off. If they waited for Nixon to win the election, Chennault told them, they would get a better deal. The Richard Nixon Foundation refutes Farrell's version of the story, categorizing Mr. Farrell's conclusion as a misinterpretation of the facts. But either way, Johnson's efforts to establish a bombing halt were thwarted on November 2nd, days before the election, when South Vietnamese President Thieu publicly announced that South Vietnam would not participate in Johnson's negotiations for a bombing halt. It was a massive blow to Humphrey's campaign, and it gave Nixon a tailwind. With victory in sight, Nixon did not relent. The day before the election, Nixon scheduled a bi-coastal telethon. For 4 hours, Nixon fielded questions from potential voters and defended his case for the presidency. He would later write, "Some of my advisors thought such a costly and tiring effort was not needed, but I overruled them. I remembered 1960 and felt I should do everything possible that might make the difference in a close election. It was my best campaign decision. Had we not had that last telethon, I believe Humphrey would have squeaked through with a close win on Election Day." The popular vote was close. Nixon won 43.4% of the popular vote to Humphrey's 42.7%, a margin of just 500,000 votes. But it was an electoral rout. Nixon won 301 to Humphrey's 191. Nixon's Southern strategy had worked. In 1968, many white Southern voters abandoned Hubert Humphrey and the Democratic Party. Nixon's victories in Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee were critical. The so-called solid Democratic South, which had largely remained intact since the days of Reconstruction, was now a thing of the past. Nixon's victory signaled that many Americans were fed up with business as usual in Washington. They were fed up with the Johnson administration and fed up with the Vietnam War. The 1968 election seemed to suggest that distrust of the government trumped Johnson's liberalism and his dream of a great society. The 1968 election was therefore arguably a major inflection point in a new conservative movement that was gaining momentum. The 1968 contest also brought about a significant change in the presidential nominating process. Going into the 1968 election, only 1/3 of party delegates were chosen in the primaries. The rest were up for grabs at each major party's national convention. But after the chaos of the 1968 Democratic Convention, many Democrats were sick and tired of party bosses ignoring the people, hand-picking establishment candidates, and shaping the platform without input from the people. As a result, and in an effort to make the political process more democratic, the Democratic Party expanded the role of state primaries. The Republicans quickly followed suit, so that in the 1972 election, for the first time in American history, the majority of delegates would be chosen, to use Richard Nixon's words, not in smoke-filled rooms by party leaders, but by the people in the fires of the primaries. This is episode 46 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1968, Law and Order. On the next episode, the election of 1972. In a contest largely defined by the Vietnam War, Republican President Richard Nixon fights with Democratic nominee Senator George McGovern, whose anti-war message must survive a political scandal that threatens to bring into question McGovern's judgment and leadership skills. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and C.L. Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
At the beginning of the 20th century, few people were interested in adopting children. One woman wanted to change that. Georgia Tann knew that orphan children just needed a second chance at life with a loving family. The problem was that she wasn't always willing to wait for children to enter the system in the usual ways, so she started stealing them. Hey, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the new true crime history podcast, American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, how one woman steered the creation of the modern adoption industry and made herself incredibly wealthy in the process. Listen to American Criminal Georgia Tann wherever you get your podcast, or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.